interviewing Professor Michael Sullivan, Emeritus Professor of Geography at Ball State University for the Ball State Oral History Project, September 28, 2005. Michael, I want to thank you for agreeing to help me with my project. With all the people I've interviewed, I've asked them to begin with kind of a general question, and that is to tell me a little bit about where you're from, your educational background, and get yourself and your long and distinguished career to the point where you said, okay, I'm going to take a job at Ball State.
Happy to do so, Warren. I could do this in 30 minutes. I'll make it short. I really could. My educational background, I started out raised in Portland, Oregon, and went down to Monmouth, Oregon, to a small teacher's college of education, now known as Western Oregon University. And did a 4-year degree there, taught social studies and English for 3 years in a junior high school in Lake Oswego, Oregon, which is a very exclusive suburb of Portland. Tired of that a bit and decided to go back to school and pick up a degree in geography, which relates probably to my interest in global international politics and that sort of thing. So I went to Portland State University for a year and a half and picked up a second bachelor's degree in geography. And there went from Portland State, was encouraged to apply at Wisconsin for the graduate program there in Milwaukee. So my wife and I made the move then from Portland to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, did a master's degree at Wisconsin-Milwaukee, then went on to Champaign-Urbana and did a doctorate. And so left Champaign-Urbana in 1971 with a PhD and took my first teaching job at Boston University. So I was at Boston University for 2 years, and then John Silber came to Boston University, and Bob Mayfield in geography, the whole kind of Texas, we call it the Texas Mafia. And so a number of us in geography and other departments at Boston left Boston University. So this is 1973, and the question was, where do we go from Boston? And so went into the job market, looked around, had 3 offers, one at Potsdam, New York, one at Fullerton, California, and one called Ball State University. And it turns out I had good friends from graduate school in Illinois who taught at Ball State, and that's Jerry Scholl. So Jerry and I had met at University of Illinois, and so interviewed at all 3 places. The last interview was in fact Ball State University. And I was quite surprised by everything I saw and everything that I learned on that little visit. And then because of friendship connections and whatnot, it was a pretty easy decision. So in the fall of 1973, my wife and 2 kids, we moved from Boston to Muncie again.
Well, no, in my case, I got to go back a step. Knowing a lot about the infamous John Silber, I have to confess, I had no idea in all the years of knowing each other that you were one of those who was part of the Silverization, shall we say, of Boston University.
I had the mistaken audacity to challenge him about a decision he made. And he let me know very, very soon and quick who was in charge.
Oh, yeah.
And it was John Silver.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, so yeah, I had that experience in Boston. But came to Ball State University very much attracted by the value then I felt placed on teaching.
And that's kind of my next question, so
Yeah.
let me just get to that. And that, when you came here, having been at a place like Boston University, what were your expectations of the role of faculty over here?
Well, based on interviews and based on conversations with them, my view was that we were first and foremost teachers. And we would devote our time to quality teaching.
Right.
And then secondarily to other aspects of our professional careers, research and service.
Okay.
But it was overwhelmingly teaching, and that's what made it very, very attractive to me.
In your career here, in what ways do you think Ball State changed? And my second question is going to be, in what ways do you think it remained the same?
Well, during my 32 years at Ball State University, it seemed like it was always an emerging university.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I got a lot of mileage out of that phrase, because I used to give talks and say that we were styled an emerging university, and faculty used to say, when will we be done emerging?
Yeah, right. back to being the university. But it's always been kind of that emerging process, and I think part of it's also trying to find its niche in the whole state system, and maybe even regionally as well. And so one that especially resonated with me was the emergence, finding the idea of teaching university, and I think it was John Warren that came up with that during his time. And I thought that was an attempt to find a pretty nice balance between teaching as well as research service, and I liked that very much. But when I first came, it was primarily still a teacher's college. Most of my students were education majors. Most of the people taking geography were going to be teachers of geography, and that's where we started. And by the time we get into the 1980s, we begin to see that we as a department, and I think as a university, began to focus more on vocational areas, application of our disciplines, and kind of diversify the kind of career opportunities there. So that's part of that kind of restructuring, I think, of the mission of the university itself.
So that's a good point, though, because unlike a lot of people I've interviewed, and later when I was provost, I watched this perhaps a little bit more closely, but your whole profession changed significantly during the time you were here. When you talk about training people who are going to go out and teach geography, talk a little bit about how and why that changed. So the department and what it does now is far different than what it did when you came here.
Right, exactly. Well, I think to a great extent, is the market changed, and people in academia had to face the reality of, if we're going to be able to have a department and have majors, we've got to be able to somehow place them in other kinds of opportunities. And education was one that was pretty glutted and no longer a viable market for us. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that there evolved a kind of a renewal of the idea of geography as a discipline of application. And so in the environmental areas, as well as in urban planning, those kinds of things, those began to kind of take hold, and then complemented with changes in technology. Okay, so we get into, by the time we get into the 1980s, you're begin to see shuttle images, satellite technology that ties to remote sensing and mapping, and so geography interfaces that very, very nicely. So all that kind of fit came together in the 1980s. So the discipline did change in terms of its orientation. I was more of the old school of kind of presumably well-read, studied in many, many different disciplines, and looked at kind of the integrated quality of geography, human and physical. As we get into the 1980s, become much more, the professionals become much more specialized and less integrated and more specific in terms of their focus. And so you become identified as a remote sensor, or you become identified as a meteorologist, and so on.
Do people still teach historical geography and physical geography?
Only in a sense of maybe what we would call the general education type course in that kind of background. Physical geography is just kind of an overview of kind of earth science. That's about the only place I've ever seen that time.
Well, those are courses that I took as part of my American Studies program in graduate school, and I noticed they kind of faded by, into the woodwork. And I think of our former graduate dean, Dave Wheeler, who was a historical geographer.
Right, right, and he taught a very good course. It was very well received, and as when he moved on, we were able to replace that.
Exactly.
But there again, it's kind of, I dare say, if we offered historical geography, we would have, on any given course, maybe a dozen students interested in taking it. And of the dozen students, 6 would probably be geography majors who were required to take it, and the other 6 would be, say, history majors.
But does the change take place in graduate preparation, where you go from the sort of academic training you had, the kind of academic training Dave Wheeler had, to the kind of academic training that someone like Kevin Turcotte has had?
Sure, absolutely. In fact, graduate schools begin to specialize themselves. And so where Turcotte, Kevin, and Vander, where they trained, was Indiana State University. And Indiana State University's graduate program in geography was essentially remote sensing. That's really what it was.
That was it?
That was essentially it. Okay, so you had these other courses you would take, so because a geographer has to know something about, historical settlements, something about atmospheric dynamics, so you have one course in that. But the core of it was remote sensing.
Which is basically high-end computers.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And so if you want to major in urban planning, you go to Penn State. If you want a good historical geography program, you go to Wisconsin-Madison,
Oh, okay.
and so on.
That's still true?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, back to the university. So you talked about the department, which I think is a very, very interesting story, because it probably changed as much as any department I know of in Ball State. But in the larger university, what kinds of changes occurred that made Ball State a different institution? And then perhaps if you could comment a bit on some things that may have stayed the same based on the 1970s to the present.
Well, certainly one of the big changes was our emphasis in promoting international studies, international programs.
Right.
I mean, I think that was a good, from one kind of a geographer, a good
right.
positive step. But I mean, today, look at the world we live in today, and and we really, we geographers have argued this for a long, long time. So that's a change in emphasis at Ball State University that was very welcome, very, very good, and continue to expand, I hope. So that's a major change. I think the change in our undergraduate program from what I would call kind of a cafeteria general studies program to one that's more prescriptive, I think that was a good, positive change, and that occurred back in the early 80s, I recall. So those are a couple of changes, and I think Tom Lowe, when the University College Dean, did a good job of really kind of tightening that up and giving it more structure. So I thought that was good. So those are two positive changes. I think things that have, the other change, maybe not so good, we could argue that, is you see the real change from the 70s into the 80s and 90s is the proportion of allocations and staffing for administrative kinds of aspects of the
I've had almost every faculty that
Sure.
I interviewed say that. Yeah.
Sure. So I mean, if you go back and look at a B book of the 1970s and compare that to, say, 2000, and just take something like computer science, I mean, it's just enormous. So that's a big change, and we could argue to discuss whether that's good or bad, necessary, and so on. But that certainly is very different.
Well, I had the same conversation 24 hours ago with Dave Annis.
Oh.
And Dave is, you're the second person in 48 hours, or 24 hours actually, who said to me, if you look at the B book. And I hadn't really, and that's a great source to do that with.
It is.
But David's comment was that even though he was critical of a lot of this, he had to admit that a lot of it has been imposed on us by changing state regulations and in particular federal regulations. We just simply dump all this stuff in and say, you got to do this, and this, and this. So,
yeah, and I think a lot of, I think computing services, for example.
Sure.
I mean, that's the kind of staff you have to have. You've got to go in the marketplace, and you've got to be able to hire, retain, and that's very, very expensive. And you just change the whole nature of the university and the structure.
Well, let me ask you about a couple other ones. Several faculty, as I'm now toward the end of this study, which I've been doing for the last year or so, have commented on the change from quarters to semesters. Does that have any impact on you? Do you care about that at all?
Oh, I care very much about that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I was a strong proponent of change.
Oh, okay.
In fact, one of the reasons I became chair, when I did become chair, was Jerry Showalter, who was a good, effective chair, a good colleague. He was beset with other kinds of issues, administrative issues, and then this was one more he was going to face, going to transition from quarter to semester, and Jerry says, I'm out of here. I'm not going to do it. So I walked into that, but I was a strong proponent of the semester system. So, and I remain that. I think it was a good decision, and I defend it, and I feel good about it.
Well, then I'll give you the other macro one that everybody tosses at me, and that is the significant changes really beginning in the early 80s. Initially, I think, with Jim Cook more than anybody else as provost, of significant changes in standards for promotion, tenure, and things of that nature.
Well, I'm one of the faculty that got hurt by that.
Well, why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, part of it is it's the nature of a changing university, and that's just going to happen. But I came to Ball State University as a teacher, and as someone who really valued teaching, maybe valued it too much, right? And maybe took teaching too seriously. You can imagine it, but I think maybe so. So what it meant was that I devoted most of my time to teaching. And by teaching, I mean, I'm not talking about just prepping things that you and I have understand lectures and that, but I mean making sure that students write papers and make sure that they rewrite those papers and make sure they understand why that's not correct and dealing with sentence structures and things that go far beyond what geography is about. And whether it's in terms of simple arithmetic, mathematics, or composition, whatever it might be. And so that was at the expense of, say, a research agenda. And so coincident with that, then, we have this changing shift with more and more emphasis on research, and I would argue, out of necessity, less and less on teaching. We could debate that, but that would be my view. And so then when it came time for promotions were heavily weighted on the side of research. And so that was viewed as being a more rigorous standard. And so, as it turned out for me, I simply wasn't promoted or promotable. And it's a situation that I faced. I wasn't promoted to full professor until 1990. So I'm in the twilight of my career. And Provost Cook was gone by that time. And other changes. And I think the year I was promoted, I think there were 21 hapless souls out of our college promoted, and I think I ranked 17. So I was fortunate to get the last 10 years of full professor, but it really took a hit on salary and whatnot. So, but I think there's a whole cohort of colleagues in the same situation that I was in. And for various reasons, we were not promotable because of our research, and that's for different kinds of reasons. But I think it's, in my case, the emphasis, I mean, my passion is teaching, not research. I would, write a little paper, I would read a paper, but that wasn't my passion. And teaching really wasn't, being fully engaged in the teaching. So I don't badmouth all that. I mean, it's a decision I made, and the university changed, and, you caught up with it. Either you change with it, or you pay the consequences.
Well, as you reflect back, do you think in the larger picture that it was a good thing for Ball State to do that as an institution, that it pretty much had to do it because of peers, similar institutions?
I'll tell you, I think if the university would structure itself in terms of, say, recruitment and hiring faculty, along the, and in order to do what I'm going to suggest, the university has to have kind of a long-range view as to what it is and what it's going to be. But if it would structure itself along the idea of comparative advantage and specialize your recruitment along those lines. And so, for example, if we're going to be a premier teaching university, what I want to do, and as I recruit, I'll pick up a proportion. 75% of my faculty, I want to be, without doubt, A1 committed teachers. All right? And that's the basis of which we're evaluated and then we're promoted. Okay? I want, out of that, say, I want another 20% to be good, solid researchers. Okay? And so these people I'm not going to hold accountable in terms of teaching. I'm going to give them a minimum teaching assignment, they're going to be research, they're going to be grantsmen, and so on and so forth. And then I'm going to have that other 5%, 2%, whatever, they're going to be doing kind of service things. All right? And that's going to be the basis of promotion and so on. And I'm going to try to keep whatever that mix is in proportions. And what that means is that people who are effective teachers, and that's what they do best, that's what they're going to be doing. Those that are effective researchers, that's what they're going to be doing, and that's what they do best. The result of that is you get greater productivity in all those three areas than if you take the assumption that everybody can do A, B, and C, and everybody's going to be held accountable for that. It doesn't work out that way. The truth of the matter is, most people are maybe mediocre to fair researchers and are average to very good teachers.
Well, especially in a place like this.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly.
I'm not saying that, obviously it isn't true.
No. But I mean, at Ball State or Fullerton or Potsdam or whatever.
Right.
And that's what it breaks out. So by making then a more rigorous demand, say, of research, then what you're doing, I think, in a sense, is that you're setting a standard whereby you are sure that the number of promotions are going to decrease significantly. And maybe that works out well in terms of budget considerations. Sure. Maybe it works out well in terms of the kind of, you might view it as maybe incentives for the kinds of behaviors and outcomes you want, whatever. But it comes at a cost.
I guess the point I'd make, and you can disagree with me if you want to, is that in the process of making these changes in the 80s, the university never really had a good, open debate discussion about what it was doing and why it was doing it. We just sort of went along and said, okay, now we're going to be teacher and scholar. And so, as you point out, we did indeed say to people, you've got to be both, and you have to demonstrate both. And you better do it from the day that you get here and unpack your briefcase and turn on your computer,
Right.
because you've got to start right from the get-go to do these things and you're going to get tenure and to get your first promotion,
Right.
et cetera. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, I look at the life of a brand new assistant professor on tenure line today and the lives of people like us, it's absolutely different.
Yeah.
100% different. I mean, when I see what these people are required to do, I was kidding Anna today, you were department head of all the junk that would make people collect as evidence that they're
Right.
good
Right.
in terms of satisfactory progress and qualifying for promotion and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, Sullivan, this is interesting.
Yeah.
This is a bit of a digression. Let's give
Yeah.
about 2 minutes here, Warren.
Sure.
1974, there was an article that appeared in an obscure journal of social sciences that argues, is looking at the issue of racial integration in schools. And it argues on the basis of the geography of that integration on a racial criterion alone is not going to be effective. It's not going to be effective because it's going to discriminate against low-income whites. It's not going to be effective because it's going to be some black out, and so on. So I mean, the argument is made that a more effective way to do this, if you really want to integrate, is to use it on the basis of some kind of economic criteria. Okay?
Yeah.
2005.
Yeah, I know where you're coming.
Yeah, you're okay.
Yeah.
New York Times writes. Okay.
Class.
Yeah.
Sure.
Bingo.
I read the series, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the obscure geographer, okay, 1974, it was Mike Sullivan. All right? In the Indiana Academy of Social Science. Yeah. So I read that, I said, isn't that amazing? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. The New York Times could devote that much time, energy, and space to the whole issue of class is still the most important thing dividing Americans. Of course, I thought you were going to throw in Hurricane Katrina. What did we learn about that?
Yeah.
What you learned about that was what you in your heart.
And again, see, and the point is, or another point is, and this is by somebody who was not promoted.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Good point.
So, just a
Well,
careful
big
observation.
picture question then. In your career, do you view the changes that occurred that you've spoken about, we've discussed a little bit, as positive or negative as far as the institution is concerned?
I would view them as necessary.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fair.
So being necessary,
Yeah.
it has to
Okay.
be in a sense positive.
Okay. Who were some of the people in your career that had a particularly important influence? You mentioned Jerry Showalter. I mean, there are others that are of consequence.
Wow. Well, I'll say a professor who just recently retired, great guy out of Portland State University, Tom Pulse, who is a political geographer and very well known in Eastern European studies, Slavic studies. But he's the guy that really encouraged me to apply at Wisconsin.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I'd have to cite Tom as a good comment. So that's one person who really was instrumental. And my two advisors, master's thesis advisor, Clint Edwards, who was a Carl Sauer scholar and really taught me by example and demand the notion of scholarship. And Howard Repke, who was my doctoral dissertation advisor, a very important figure. And I might add his wife. And I mentioned his wife because when I was all done my dissertation, I'm at Boston, and it's meeting its final test, and its final test is by the librarian.
Right.
To make sure that the borders are correct.
Yeah, right.
I get this call saying that my dissertation can be accepted because of a border violation. I was screaming on the phone. Oh, anyway, long story short, my advisor's wife changed it. Bless her heart. So that's
This guy's name was Repke?
Repke. Yeah,
Same
same as
spelling?
Hal. Yeah, same as Hal. Not related, but
Right, yeah.
Howard Repke and his wife Ruthie. So I owe Ruthie a big thank you on that. So those are people, you know, prior to coming to Ball State University. At Ball State University, I'd have to give a lot of credit to Ed Lyon, who was the chap that invited me. Yeah. And Ed's an interesting guy. He's ashamed, no, not ashamed, he's embarrassed by his innate intelligence. So what Ed always do is downplay his innate brightness and kind of take on this role of old country bumpkin. I never quite understood that. But nonetheless, he was the guy that initiated my coming to Ball State University. So give Ed a lot of credit for that. I appreciate that. Well, those are big people. And then my usual colleagues.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's for sure. Tell me a bit about your areas of involvement in the university. What kinds of things particularly interested you beyond doing what was of the uppermost importance in
Well,
your teaching?
I was on what was called the Undergraduate Education and Policy Council. I think that's right, maybe.
UAPC.
Yeah, right. And one of the things that came out of that was I was challenged to write, and did write, the first requirement in the program for an international component to the program. So I wrote that. I remember Wake Janet said, well, you think so big about that, why don't you write that? So I did. And so that component of the University Core program now, it came out of that committee. I wrote that part. So I felt good about that. I felt very good about my 5 years as chair of the Department of Geography. And that was 87, 92. And that was a time when we got the remote sensing, GIS started. We started the lab. We were able to kind of orchestrate space and expand space, develop that lab. Those things happened. Really good. So those are a couple things outside of teaching that I felt really good about having achieved at Ball State University.
How about areas of involvement in the community? Any of importance in your life that you reflect upon?
Yeah, you may not remember this, but from 1980 to 84, I served on the park board.
I do remember.
And I locked horns with Jim Carey, the aspiring mayor and then soon-to-be mayor.
Yeah, that's right.
Mayor-elect.
And my neighbor.
Yeah, okay. So I got involved in local politics in that front, and in some sense represented Ball State University and tried to provide for rational planning. And actually we did. In terms of the 4 years I was on the board, we made some major changes, moving the park board out of patronage into kind of professional qualification. And so we hired actual park planners for a short period of time until Jim came back. And we made some major renovations in major parks. Tui Pool was renovated and reopened when I was on the park board and president of the park board at the time. So there were those kinds of community involvement.
How'd you get on there?
It was by appointment. So Alan Wilson was the Republican mayor, and he had to appoint a Democrat.
That's right, I remember
So
that.
somehow my name came up, and I got onto that board. And that was my little dabble in Muncie politics. Yeah.
Great contribution to the community.
So,
But yeah, you've done a lot. I can't let you get away on this point. You've done a lot with this area where you live downtown.
Oh, yes.
I mean, talk a bit about that.
yeah, well, my wife and I, 15 years ago, moved into East Central neighborhood, which is just east of downtown Muncie. And it's a historic district. And we bought a small Italianate little house that two guys had owned it before us, and they did most of the hard work on restoration on it. So we bought it. I tell people we bought it 80% restored. It's now 65% restored. And that's more true than I'd like to admit, actually. But so every year we have a festival, the Washington Festival, and we neighborhood members are all very involved in that. So we're very involved in that. We're organizing the house tour or the bean booth, so you get your old cornbread, beans, and ham. We serve that, cook that up. So I'm very much involved in that. And then I was on the board for about a 10-year period, the neighborhood board. And there you cope with the realities of the angst between renters and homeowners, upper middle income households versus poor, Section 8 housing versus home ownership, and those kinds of issues. So
how's that neighborhood doing from your perspective?
It's doing very well from my perspective, given the kinds of constraints it faces, mostly financial and people moving further out into the suburbs and building more and more housing stock, and the city is losing population, so that really depresses housing values. So in that sense, it's kind of difficult. I've always said the neighborhood is good and secure as the next neighbor that moves in, and it will vary according to the renters that move in. So I've had some run-ins with some good people in the past. Right now, it's doing very, very well. Although we have right now a major issue with ACREC, which is a reinvestment corporation, which is kind of the financial part of the neighborhood, but it runs independently of the neighborhood association. And so now there's some questions about the management administration of that program, which has been very successful in terms of leveraging money, rehabbing, and that sort of thing. There's some controversy about vested interest, and so on and so forth. So we'll see how that works out. It's under investigation. If I could. Yeah.
A macro question. What's your perspective on the role of the faculty during the time you were at Ball State? Do you think the faculty had an appropriate role in governance and decision making, et cetera, or could it have been better?
I think it could have been better, but I don't know that the Senate is the right kind of format to
Okay.
make it better.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. One thing I think you want to avoid in university is never letting the faculty make the decisions for the university. I think that makes it a disaster. I have no problem with it.
Yeah.
So I don't have any problem with having strong administration and making tough decisions, and in fact, that's what they should be doing. But I think it's very, very important that you get a broad kind of faculty input, and whether through a council or advisory or what it might be, but I think it really should be there, and it should be real and genuine. But no, I feel very comfortable with a very clear division between administration and faculty.
Okay. Well, I guess I brought that up because when I started doing these interviews, there was still a lot of ferment. There still may be, as far as I know, because I'm kind of removed from this, but people who would say to me, you know, Warren, it would have been a lot better if over the years we had had a faculty senate and not a university senate, which had people like the senior administration and a whole bunch of students in it. That you would have gotten a clearer voice if there had been a faculty senate, because then you, as provost and president, board, et cetera, would have known that the faculty felt this way or that way about a particular issue. And that's really, I guess, what the question I'm asking, as to whether or not we have been ill-served by having this kind of everybody's in it university senate structure, which now has been changed a little bit, because I guess we now have a faculty council that sort of advises the senate.
I think that's probably true, but I don't know but what every administrator has a pretty good view as to what the faculty senate was on any given kind of issue. I don't think the fact that the university senate was comprised of a mix of faculty and administrators diluted that much.
Okay.
What do faculty really think? I mean, I think the newer provost usually what faculty really thought about issues A, B, C, and I think probably every other administrator would know pretty clearly what it would be, regardless of what the university senate might decide.
Right.
Within that, you would have a good sense of
Yeah.
what the faculty thought.
Well, you could find out anyway.
Sure.
I mean, if you had good deans, and I think particularly last year you were over there, I think Ron Johnstone was the kind of person who had a good faculty heart.
Yes.
And he
yes.
tended to try to find out what this rather large, unwieldy entity called the College of Sciences and Humanities was thinking on a particular issue.
Right. No, I don't have as much angst about that.
This is kind of, I think, an important question for somebody who has been living in the part of town you live in, but I'd like you to comment a little bit on the relationship over the years you've been here between town and gown. Do you think it's better today, not so great today, it was better when you came here? I mean, we hear so much about this, and I think the university spends a lot of time trying to speak to town-gown relationships, and I think you come at this from a very different perspective than a lot of people here.
I don't think it's particularly good.
Okay.
I don't think it was particularly good when I came here in 1973, so I don't know that it's deteriorated. I can't say that. But, you know, in hindsight, I think, what if the university had constructed, say, something like an Emeritus downtown instead of on campus? What if the arena, okay, had been somewhere in the central city rather than on campus or whatnot,
Right.
and how it could be used for other kinds of venues or whatever else? That would really bridge this town-gown notion. But that's all by hindsight. One of the things I find striking, I think maybe we're improving on this, but I mean, I've always found it striking that Muncie Public Schools, the public schools in Muncie, especially the central and east town and south town, really have problems with student achievement. And then here is this pool of academic talent and students who are going to be teachers. And it always struck me as curious that we were never able to leverage and marshal the resources of the university to the public education needs of the children of Muncie, Indiana. And I really found that striking, and we weren't very successful at doing that. And I don't know why that was. Maybe we're doing a better job of it now.
There's a gulf there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems to be that with the resources we have at Teachers College, that there shouldn't be any school or any classroom, say in K through 5, wherein there is a reading situation where there is a reading specialist or a student who has some knowledge about teaching reading with more than 5 students, 10 max.
Yeah.
And same with mathematics, all right? So that K through 5, kids in Muncie Public Schools are going to really have a lot of hands-on, one-on-one instruction, tutoring, and help in reading and math. And we never did that, I don't think. At least, maybe we have in the last 5 years.
Yeah, I think Roy Weaver, the current dean of Teachers College, in the last several years, I can't say the number with accuracy, has tried to do this by this network of schools that they've got. They're sort of their partners. It's got a name, I can't think of what it is. But I know the Muncie Community Schools are part of that now. I know that, there's some schools up in Marion, there are a bunch of them in northern Indianapolis. And they have faculty now who spend more time than they did when I came here, certainly, going out into the schools and working as professional development schools or something like that. I think it's PDS. But I think it's a good point. I mean, I think there's always been, not so much with the current superintendent, but with his predecessors, some reluctance. I'm not saying it's entirely our fault. I think there's been some attempts to try to do more of this, but there's been a kind of, we're the Muncie Community Schools, and we don't want to have you coming in here telling us what to do.
Right.
But I think it's a...
Well,
it's a good
here's something
point.
I suggested to Alan Wilson back in my political days in the 80s. And we were just chatting. We started about something else, and he had some time on his hands, so we just kind of a free chat. And so we're talking about revitalizing downtown. And so when I said, you know what, now this is 1982, I said, you know what, if you would partner, say we partner with Ball State University and develop, say, an Institute of Asian Studies or an Institute of Japanese Culture. And it's a city-university kind of partnership. And what that means basically is the city's going to go out and try to, partner with sister city relationships in Japan, and the university is going to be teaching Japanese and Japanese history and culture and whatever else. You can then parlay that into maybe recruiting some kind of future employer, Japanese, for Muncie, Indiana. Okay, we just laugh. It's just, the academics are so ivy tower and all that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, in 2005, if we'd done something like that in the 1980s, and we'd had this kind of little community that is embracing East Asian culture and maybe Japanese in particular, or Chinese today, I dare say we would have had maybe a leg up on some kind of recruitment of a Japanese firm or something like that. So that's a kind of opportunity that is so evident today, right? That if we'd acted maybe in 1980, we'd be in a little better situation.
Well, we now are in a period where there seems to be much more success in terms of trying to revive downtown. Living closer to it than I do. I mean, is that the perspective that you have?
Right. Oh, absolutely. I think we partly, it's controversial. People say we put too much money into downtown at the expense of, sidewalks, curbing, and somewhere else, whatever. But it has been very, very successful. I mean, in the last 10 years, the revitalization, restoration of downtown has been amazing.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody said to me 15 years ago that we were going to have some decent places to eat in Smackville downtown Muncie, they were nuts.
Right.
I mean, I think by having something like Jeremy's and Mezzaluna, now they got that little food court deal. I was down there yesterday at White River Landing for a meeting, and then went down the corner and had an ice cream.
Yeah.
And that new ice cream store.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
I agree. Yeah. I agree. And I've got to believe that if we can improve some of the other kind of infrastructure issues, roads, for example.
Yeah, right.
When a visitor comes to Muncie, Indiana, they make note of that. Here's a nice little town that has an awful lot going for it. Now, the town of Gallup, one of the nice things we do at the university, of course, are all the kinds of lectures we have, the presentations, and the symphony, and athletics. So Muncie's a delightful place to the university.
I think it's like Bozeman, Montana, and Montana State. I mean, I think of what the place would be like without Ball State. I once raised this in an American history class, and the student shot up her hand and said, "I'll tell you what it'd be like." I said, "What?" Kokomo. And I thought, well, yeah, I mean, because, as the Linds famously said in Middletown in transition, by the mid-1930s, the Teachers College had become the major importer of cultural events in the community. Well, I mean, there's no question that's true. I mean, as your colleague David Addis said yesterday, since he's quite interested in music, he said, "My God, you could go to 4 concerts a day." If you look at the publication from the School of Music on a semester-by-semester basis.
Absolutely.
Well, those are all the prepared questions I have, but at the end of all of my interviews, I always say, for the person being interviewed. This is your opportunity to reflect and contemplate and tell posterity anything else you want to tell posterity.
Well, yeah,
anything you want to add,
anything
sir?
I want to add, anything I want to add. Well, you know, one of the things I find striking is I talked to a number of colleagues who retired, angry. I mean, I'm amazed. I don't know if you come across that or not, Warren, but a number of people, faculty I took who retired, they're angry at the university.
Huh.
Now maybe it's that...
They should go in the hospital for a while. They'd appreciate it a lot more.
Yeah.
Have them go take out your spleen, you know,
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah. And I think a good part of that is that cohort that got caught up in that kind of transition process.
Yeah.
And I'm not part of that. Okay, I'm not part of it. I didn't do well financially relative to other colleagues.
Right.
But I did what I enjoyed doing, and I was passionate about it, and I had a good 33 years at Ball State University. So I had no complaints about that. I mean, it's just the way things change. And that's the way it works out. So I have no admonitions or words of wisdom to add to it.
I appreciate that. Thanks for doing the
Yeah.
interview. Oh, one last question before
Yeah.
we get cut. You mentioned being out in Oregon, which I never really knew. Where'd you meet your wife?
Oh, at this little teacher's college in
Oh,
Oregon.
okay.
Yeah. And then she finished up at Portland State.
Okay.
And then all the time I was in graduate school, she taught. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, she taught in the inner cities with Father Grumpy. Remember Father
Yeah,
Grumpy?
I do,
Marching?
sure. Oh,
Yeah,
great protests in Milwaukee.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
sure.
Well, okay, we were part of that scene in the
Yeah.
Civil Rights March and open housing
Yeah.
business. And did some tutoring of inner cities kids. And then when I was at Champaign-Urbana, she taught 1 year an accelerated group of kids. And that was just a wonderful experience for her. And then we started a family. But that's where we met.
She's still teaching.
And she's still teaching
Yeah.
piano. Yeah.
I thought
yeah.
she still had some involvement with the School of Music.
Yeah, she does. But,
Well, thank you very much for
well, my
participating.
pleasure, Warren. Enjoyed it very much.